Hello, good morning. Welcome to Messums Yorkshire. I'm Johnny Messum. This is Joe Nickols, and you're joining us this morning to talk and discuss Korean ceramics. It's at the heart of our exhibition here in Harrogate. It's coming on for another week and a half, and I believe it's the first time that these remarkable artists, Chung and Soo-Jong, have shown here in this country and indeed in this part of the world. So lucky are we, well, not only do we have working with us a great expert in Japanese and Korean art, but also a great talker who happens also to come from Yorkshire. So a triumph of opportunity that we're very happy to share with you this morning, and just dig a little deeper into a world of art that I think when we first come to it probably feels a bit arcane. But I think as we just explore and chat a little bit, I think you'll find some of the things which really make these works very special, obviously, but also make them more comprehensible. There's some of the history, the civilization, because Joe, you studied SOAS, Japanese and Korean ceramics, am I right?
Yes, yeah. So I study actually Chinese as well. So I do the whole East Asian spectrum. But these vessels in particular are so inspiring to me. They're ones that really made me want to pursue my interests in East Asia, more so than many other types of ceramics.
I kind of feel like we built this show for you, but in reality, it's come together very well.
I find it very difficult to say to people, it wasn't me who did this. Yeah. It was amazing to come into a gallery that already had an interest in Korea and in vessels that are unusual to a European perspective.
Amazing. Me too. So I wonder if we could unpick, because there are two artists here in this exhibition, Soo-Jong and Chung. I think I would summarize Ri as perhaps being sort of the grand master, I suppose, in some way.
Yeah, so Soo-Jong is born in 1948, whereas Chung is 1967. So they have slightly different perspectives because they've experienced very different parts of Korean history. So when you think of Korea as a nation, the 20th century was incredibly tumultuous. You have so many things happening from Japanese occupation in the early parts of the 20th century up until 1945. You have American occupation, you have the Korean War in the 50s, you have in South Korea, you have the dictatorship of Park Chung-hee, and then the military dictatorship in the 80s, and then you have the economic crash in the 90s, leading to the IMF bailout in 1977. So you have this rapidly changing landscape, and within each sort of period, you have different art movements that are happening. And you can see the impact of those different art movements from these generational perspectives.
That's really understandable, yeah.
Yeah. So here we have these moon jars, which are much more inspired by a 1970s movement called Tansekwa, which is monochrome painting, whereas Chung is inspired by something sort of a bit later in the 1980s called Mingjun, which is all about the day-to-day and including the experience of daily life and what does it mean to be Korean every day in the work. But both of them have this respect for this huge heritage of Korean ceramics, particularly through the moon jar, which is this incredible vessel here. And actually, Chung does a lot of moon jars in their other work, which are incredibly beautiful. Normally, they're quite lopsided.
He has his own, as you say, language, and I love the differentiation you made of age, and also therefore the kind of like the sort of histories that they're reacting and responding to. We should talk a little about this shape, because the moon jar is more than just where we might come to from a European perspective as a sort of a vessel. It's a metaphor in some ways, I think, isn't it, for other things?
Yes, so the moon jar is really unique. So as I mentioned, in the 20th century, we have this huge sort of tumultuous history that is happening. And in that, a lot of Korean identities are being challenged, particularly due to the 1950s Korean War. So you have the divide between North and South Korea. You also have this, before then, this disconnect with heritage caused by the Japanese occupation. If you were an artist in in Korea during the early part of the 1900s, you were not allowed to study in Korea, and indigenous Korean practices were actually kind of stopped by the Japanese colonial government, and you would have to go to Tokyo to train. And so there's this real kind of division between what does it mean to be a contemporary modern Korean person who has been disconnected from the heritage that you would have otherwise experienced. And these moon jars become indicative of that. So this shape is uniquely Korean. You never find the shape in Japanese or Chinese ceramics. It's made by throwing two separate bowls on a potter's wheel and then connecting them at the middle. In traditional wares, you would sort of soften the join. So it would appear to be one complete sphere. And that's where they get their name from, their moon vessels. But they have nothing to do with moon worship or anything like that. It's just purely the shape. In Korean, they're called Pekhang Ali. And they have another name of Pekja, which means Great White Lake of Porcelain. So there are different interpretations of it. Normally, the base is slightly narrower than the mouth of the vessel, which kind of gives it a sort of sense of it floating, because the weight sort of looks like it's heading upwards. But with the modern reinterpretation, it is about a divided Korea. So this lip here becomes the separation between North and South Korea. For many Koreans today, it's the sort of emancipation of the pain that the Korean Peninsula experienced to reunite Korea together. And so you have this sort of longing for this join to be invisible again. So by highlighting this join, you have this sort of
open wound.
Yeah, it is this open wound. It really is. I mean, that's such a good way to put it. And then with Soo-Jong, you have these incredible calligraphic marks put upon these vessels. Normally, these would have been completely white. So when these vessels first appeared in the 18th century during the Choson period, which is one of the longest dynasties in East Asia, it was from 1392 to 1895, and it was a Confucianist state. And for a Confucianist aesthetics, white was the color. It's a symbol of sort of purity and unity and lightness. And it was, so these would have been pure white. So to have these incredibly sort of strong brush marks on top of it, it's almost sort of to talk about the pain of losing that purity of culture, that individual identity, which feeds into, again, this 1970s movement called Tansekwa. Now, Tansekwa was mainly a painting movement. You have people like Park Si-bo, who is exhibited quite internationally these days, who would meditate upon traditional Korean arts. They would make paper out of mulberry bark, which is what Buddhist sutras used to be written on. So you have this sort of connection with history. And then after meditating, it would be about repetitive movements, incising pencils and paint into this paper. And then it would sort of have this connection to this lost history. And all of these works would be done in these incredibly muted tones. And I feel like this is another reference to that. This is a real kind of sort of concise, introspective essay on what does it mean to be a Korean in the 21st century? What does it mean to have that heritage? What does it mean to be disconnected from that time?
And also crucially an artist, I think, as well, don't you? Because the mark making are the marks of an artist, because I think he spent some time in California as well, didn't he? So you sort of feel like maybe those summary thoughts of mark making that would be understood in a more universal sense are coming in there, so it's sort of interface those two cultures.
Yes, yeah, and I really like that idea of artist interaction, because with moon jars, they were originally kind of authorless in a way. And so, Soo-Jong is really sort of laying claim to moon jars being part of their individual identity, because obviously you have, once you have a disconnect with the heritage, it kind of becomes an individual pursuit to reconnect. And so you have your own kind of perspective on that reconnection. And I think this is a really, really important one, because throughout the exhibition, you can see that there are different styles of moonjar, there are different shapes, there are different tonalities appearing. And that's really it's really interesting because
it's very personal, isn't it?
It's very personal. The original moonjars, they often have these imperfections within them because of the handmade nature of them, and the variability of clay and the glaze. They each are kind of unique, and that imperfection is something that aristocratic Koreans would respect. This understated sort of beauty that's within these objects, and yet this idea of sort of not having them completely spherical, this lopsidedness. There's a real kind of inner spirit within them. And what I really like is that Soo-Jong has incised the lids of many of these with abstract patterns.
Yes, I like that too. I was wondering what those were meant. And as you say, they are the marks of so much of an individual. And I love the idea of that meditation, because there seems to be so much power caught up in those marks, aren't they? Now, I was talking to you earlier about these very special vessels, and I'm going to have to hold one of these up just to examine it and talk about it, because and I could mangle the pronunciation for you, or I could ask Joe.
So these are bunchong vessels. And these are really interesting. And I was going to bring them up because I believe that the incisions in these vessels come from the history of these vessels. So in this collection of works, you can tell that Soo-Jong has a complete understanding of ceramic history. So Koreans have this immense ceramic legacy. In the 12th century, there was a Chinese ambassador to Korea called Soo-Jong, who talked about how the celadon wares in Korea had far exceeded those within China. So we have this sort of idea that Chinese porcelain and Chinese vessels were the ones that were most desired throughout the whole of history, when in fact in China, these vessels were desired. And these vessels actually became culturally so important that Korea had to ask China not to request these as tribute, and instead Korea started to give all of their gold and silver to China in forms of taxes. And so these vessels became the internal sort of tax system. So people used to pay their taxes in bunchong ceramics, and these were really revered by the aristocratic members of society. Now, in Korea, they didn't actually invest in gold, silver, or bronze mining, even though it was a big part of their economy. They invested far more in mining for clay, and there are huge amounts of kilns. Some are still being excavated. And so these kinds of stoneware became incredibly, incredibly popular, even by lower class people. And there's a lot of humor in these vessels. When you look at bunchong ware, they are about the abstracted shapes. They will often have incisions in them. And yeah, this would not be out of place in a 15th century Korean home. This is, it's an amazing thought. This one has, I just want to bring this one up to the camera. I don't know if you can see here, but you've got these amazing incisions that are going through the glaze. And this is definitely referencing Korean metalwork. So a lot of ceramics during the Choson period were inspired by a lot of the bronze work. Because all of the bronze were being sent to China, you have to have this kind of replacement. So they kind of developed this kind of style of work to be a sort of in-between. And so these become these really bizarre, abstracted, funny sort of objects, which I think they are just so beautiful. They become so desired that people start to stamp government departments on the bottom. So you would give these as taxes to various government departments, and then people would steal them from banquets. And so they then get stamped with these marks so that you wouldn't be able to steal them. And if you were found with them, then you would be prosecuted. So these become these really kind of interesting objects that we would look at and we'd think, oh, this is very kind of Bernard Leach, this is very kind of, looking at raw, but actually these were really high class aristocratic vessels that were sort of part of the court. These were used in rituals for, Confucian temples. And then as time went on in Choson, Korea, you had this obsession with pure white glaze. And so these kind of brown, bronzy colors sort of start to disappear, and you have them start to imitate the moon jars. So you then have this kind of full circle moment. And so that's why I think these vessels are kind of the combination of the pure white Confucian utensils and these earlier aristocratic like bukchong wares. I just think they're wonderful. I think they are amazing.
Right. It's lovely to hear you talk about them, and actually it does bring them to life very much, and to bring those two references in together.
I mean, that's the more I spend here with Rhee's work, the more I am so aware of their complete mastery of ceramic history and ceramic design, looking at the whole kind of cultural zeitgeist that has existed throughout, the past 700-800 years within Korea.
Yeah, he really is the master from that perspective, and that's a little bit of what we're just unpicking and exploring here today. And I wonder, by way of reference, whether we could just have a look at Lee Chung's pieces as well, which are so fun.
So
I love this one here.
Shall we come down here? So Lee Chung is similarly brilliant with their ceramics. Very different. So obviously we're now injecting color. We've got this kind of play on scale. It's really interesting when you read interviews with Yi, and you understand their kind of way of looking at Korean history. These really start to make sense. So with Lee Soo-Jong's work, you're having this introspection to a particular form of Korean identity. Whereas with Yi Chung, what we're really looking at is what does it mean to have that Korean identity in the everyday. So these vessels are challenging, conventional ideas of what can be ceramics. And if ceramics are indicative of being Korean, how can you incorporate that into something that you experience regularly? It's really about shifting the perspective. So when you are challenged with a work that you don't understand, you spend time trying to comprehend it. It's kind of meant trying to surprise you into re-examining how you interact with everyday objects. So this plant pot, which has been, it's been made tall, it's got these sort of strange marks on it, sort of almost like cowhide. They kind of bring out this sort of extraordinary
mixed messages, aren't they?
Hugely mixed messages, and like brings that humor into it as well. I think one of the really interesting things when you look at kind of art theory is that use of humor, the use of parody to unpick something or to challenge a convention. So when you have to look twice, you kind of look at the limits of what your own expectations are. So Yi is really trying to get you to challenge what you are doing in your everyday. What does it mean to be Korean every day in this globalized world? In 1997, as I said, you have this IMF bailout. And because of that, you then have this huge boom of like Americanism. And you further have this sort of disconnect with what a Korean identity is. Today, there are over 12 million Koreans who live outside of Korea. So you have this huge diasporic communities who are kind of, again, further disconnected from their heritage. So you have Yi, who's trying to get the world to be perceived from a kind of Korean perspective, or not even necessarily a Korean perspective, but one that is introspective, if you're looking for your identity, if you're looking for who you might be, if you're wondering about your own history, your own past, where you've come from, these vessels are designed to make you stop and reevaluate how you are moving around the physical world.
Yeah. And I think we can't not finish without having a moment on that Soo-Jong, which is just all of the things you've described, and makes me laugh, and it's full of joy, actually.
So Chung's work often focuses on collections of objects. So you'll often go, if you go to, if anybody's seen any of Yi's work in Korea, you'll often see that they have long tables filled with small ceramic objects that all have an interaction together. But to offset those works, Yi does a series called Art's Furniture, and this is probably the most sort of indicative of that work. This Soo-Jong, it's big, it's unexpected. You can definitely sit on it. It's very comfortable, and it's unexpected. And Yi will often talk about trying to bring stories out through soil. Yi is obsessed with this idea that through soil or clay, within that is contained the history of the sort of ground that it came from. And so when you have these objects that you sit on and that you interact with, you again are adding to that story, or maybe you're taking that story away with you. So you have this real appreciation of the material, the history, and then challenging what your expectations are. And I think today, when we are bombarded with sort of imagery that tries to get people to conform to various ideals of beauty and homogenizing cultures, it's objects like this and moonjars like these where you are forced or encouraged to stop and reflect and be surprised and be taken out of yourself, that really kind of, I don't know, make you appreciate where life could go, not just where it's come from. Absolutely. And I think that that's really the message of contemporary Korean ceramics. It's that introspection into identity. It's the moving forward. It's the understanding of the past and a desire for the future.
I think that's absolutely beautifully put. Joe, that was wonderful. I'm going to take a moment on this fantastic bit of furniture. I think you describe it so well. It roots you into the past and makes you think about the future. And it feels very integrated. It's a beautiful, beautiful object, as they are all. As actually was your introduction and survey there as well, which was very beautiful in its own right. So thank you for that.
No, thank you for having this exhibition. I really hope everybody comes and is inspired by these vessels. When I first saw them, I was amazed by them. I think, just to make one final point, one of the exciting things about moon jars is that when they were first made in the 18th century, they were simply made as kitchenware, these utensils. They weren't like these elevated material. Yes, they were occasionally used in rituals, and yes, they were part of the aristocratic sort of material culture. But we don't have these huge records of people fawning over them. These vessels, because of their like unique history of being purely Korean objects, have become the emblem of Korean introspection today. And again, that idea of repurposing the past for today is so beautiful and so inspiring that I hope, I hope everybody wants to see more Korean ceramics and more of the excitement that contemporary artists in beyond Europe are creating.
Yeah, I think so too. I think they're going to have an influence, and certainly they should be seen more widely here, which is terrific. Folks, thank you very much for joining us. It's been a joy talking with Joe. It's a brilliant insight into the work. If you want to reconnect on anything that's been talked about today, do get in touch with us directly or come back later on. This talk will be recorded and available on our website, which is on Messums Yorkshire. So click like and subscribe.
Yes, yeah. And if you have any questions, email away, and more than happy to answer anything.
We are here. Great stuff. All right.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Bye.